Now, if you're into your trains or you're into your London history, you might well have heard of something called the Northern Heights. This was an incomplete project to extend the Underground into what was then the countryside, with the hope that it would bring new development to the area. It was planned, construction was begun, but ultimately it never really happened. Well, did you know that there was also a Southern Heights? This was an incomplete project to extend commuter railways into what was then the countryside, with the hope that it would bring new development to the area. It was planned, but ultimately it never really happened. The Southern Heights Light Railway would have begun at Orpington, meandered around the countryside, and terminated at Sanderstead. Those in charge were so confident in the scheme that it actually appeared on contemporary maps in the late 1920s. What makes it interesting to me is that this was the final project of a man named Colonel Holman F. Stevens. Stevens was an engineer and railway promoter who was sort of the opposite of most of the railway promoters that I talk about on this channel, in that his deal was saving money rather than spending it. He built some lines and took others over, but what all his projects had in common was that they were cheap. He'd use second-hand locomotives and rolling stock, the track would be lightly laid, and the buildings would be minimal. He would run his lines with the strict discipline you would expect of a lieutenant colonel. In fact, train crews on his lines developed special signals to warn station staff if the boss was on board and planning to pay a surprise visit. And for all his lines are famous for being eccentric and ramshackle, the fact is that he kept them going long after anyone else would have given up. Many kept going long after the colonel's passing, and you can even ride some of them to this day. If you like an odd railway, and I do, the colonel's empire of light railways is endlessly fascinating. But the Southern Heights was something very different. It was to be a fully up-to-date commuter line, about as far from wheezing Victorian tank engines on rural light railways as you could get. The scheme had started out as one authorised in 1898 called the Orpington, Cudham and Tatsfield Light Railway. Colonel Stevens was the engineer, but it would have been operated by the South Eastern Railway, who owned the line from London through Orpington. In fact, to all intents and purposes, it would have been a branch of the South Eastern Railway, albeit an independently owned one. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Funds could not be raised. That's not entirely surprising. The late 19th century had seen a whole flurry of railway lines constructed to the south of London, and many of them had been financial disasters. I can understand why investors might have been reluctant. The Orpington, Cudham and Tatsfield folded in 1906. Still, Stevens never gave up on the idea. In 1899, the South Eastern Railway had become part of the South Eastern and Chatham Railway, and in 1923 that became part of the Southern Railway, as did all the major companies in the south of England. I should note that the Colonel's own lines were, on the whole, not considered major. Commuter traffic was one of the Southern's main sources of revenue, and so they began a programme of modernisation. At the same time, London was changing. Railways meant that it was practical and affordable for people who worked in London to live in the countryside. In fact, new suburbs sprang up along the railways, turning villages into towns and fields into estates. Railways were creating their own market. So it's perhaps no surprise that the Colonel dusted off the plans for the Orpington, Cudham and Tatsfield in the 1920s. In late 1925, the proposal was announced. Now it was known as the Southern Heights Light Railway, a rather more picturesque name. The Colonel was identified as agent to the promoters, which is perhaps not surprising given that he was one of the major promoters. The line was to be rather longer than its planned predecessor, extending beyond Tatsfield to Sanderstead, where it would meet the main line. It was also to have been rather more solidly engineered than the previous proposal. It would have been single-track, but with the possibility of doubling the track if traffic demanded it. There would have been stations at Orpington, Farnborough, Down, Cudham and Biggin Hill, Westerham, Tatsfield, Warlingham, Hornsey Green, Hamsey Green, Mitchley Wood. There would have been a junction on the line to Oxted, and finally Sanderstead. Several of these would have been simple halts rather than full stations. The line would have been about 15 miles long. It was also to be electrified. These days, light rail is basically always electrified, but back then it was unheard of. Electric railways were increasingly common, but still the concept wasn't really seen as compatible with something as low budget as a light railway. And here I should point something else out about the Colonel. While his lines may have looked like something out of Ivor the Engine, he was also interested in embracing new technology, where he felt that it could save money. So it's not so strange that he should have considered electric power, especially for what he no doubt hoped would be a heavily used commuter line. There were also to be coaling and watering facilities for steam locomotives, which would haul goods trains over the line. The Southern Railway were interested, and the Colonel attended a meeting with them in 1926 to discuss cooperation. While the Southern Heights would be independently owned, it would be operated by the Southern Railway. The lines through Orpington and Sanderstead both led to Charing Cross, so the Southern realised that, using the SHLR, they could run a circular service from Charing Cross to Charing Cross. Sir Herbert Walker, the general manager of the Southern Railway, proposed that they might also electrify it and provide funds towards the construction. The directors of the Southern Railway were agreeable, and so were the Colonel and his fellow promoters. In 1928 they got a light railway order and construction was authorised. The Southern Railway would have the option to buy the line outright after 5 years. There was surprisingly little opposition to the scheme. There were objections, but many of the landowners realised that their land would become more valuable for having a railway passing through. Developers were keen on the scheme because they saw it as an opportunity to build more rail-served suburbs. And the RAF were foursquare behind it as the line would serve the aerodrome at Biggin Hill. Unfortunately, investors were not so keen. Railways were by no means guaranteed to be profitable. This one ran through a very sparsely populated area, and while it was hoped that the line would attract development, no one could say how long that would take to come through. Britain was in something of an economic slump, which only became worse after the Wall Street crash of 1929. Stevens looked to America to finance his railway, perhaps inspired by the antics of the likes of Whittaker Wright or Charles Yerkes, who had gone to America to pay for the London Underground. But the Americans were no more keen than the British, even with the Colonel visiting in person. Oddly enough, there was money available to get railways built at the time. The government was offering loans for major projects that could provide employment. That's how the northern extension of the Piccadilly line got built. But for whatever reason, they don't seem to have gone for this with the Southern Heights Light Railway. Anyway, more changes were coming. In the early 1930s, there were rumblings that the railways of London would fall under a new London Passenger Transport Board. If so, who could say what would become of the Southern Heights? But the project was about to be dealt a far greater, fatal blow. In 1931, Colonel Stevens passed away at the age of 62. It seemed that nobody else had his faith in the project and the drive to get it built, and the Southern Railway quietly gave up. The project was formally abandoned that year. But the project did have some knock-on effects. The Southern Railway had made plans to reopen the closed Woodside and South Croydon Joint Railway, which served Sanderstead. Though the Southern Heights was gone, the reopening went ahead, and the upgraded, electrified line carried its first passengers in 1935. Much of its route would ultimately become part of the Croydon tram system in 2000. Were the Southern Railway right to abandon the light railway? It's hard to say. It is worth noting that the line would have been relatively slow and indirect. Under the laws governing light railways, trains would have been limited to a speed of 25 miles per hour. Other local lines, like the Woodside and South Croydon, struggled to attract passengers, and it's hard to see the Southern Heights not running into similar difficulties. On the other hand, the Colonel had performed seeming miracles in keeping failed lines open, so perhaps there's some parallel universe where it's a key part of the London commuter network. These days, electric light railways are seen as the saviour of many underused rail routes. So maybe Stevens was ahead of his time. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the Colonel to my unprofitable railway. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.